Both on this old house and the new Yankee Workshop for years, we have always promoted safety in all aspects of what we do, but most importantly, in eye protection.
A man built 235 pieces of furniture on national television, never used a stunt double, never faked a cut, and never once complained on camera. Then one October morning in 2009, the network he'd worked for quietly announced that the show was over. No farewell episode, no dramatic goodbye, just a short statement, and 21 years of Saturday mornings came to an end. Millions of people who had grown up watching him were left asking the same question. Why would anyone walk away from something that was still working? Here's what actually happened, and why the real answer says more about the man than any scandal ever could. Before we get into the ending, it helps to understand what this show actually was, because by today's standards, it shouldn't have worked at all. There was no competition, no countdown clock, no twist, just a carpenter named Norm Abram standing in a workshop behind a Massachusetts farmhouse, building furniture from start to finish, explaining every decision along the way. It premiered in 1989, produced by Russell Moash, the same man behind This Old House, who had spent years watching Abram work as the show's lead carpenter and noticed something worth building an entire program around. Abram wasn't flashy. He wasn't trying to entertain in the traditional sense. He was simply good at his craft, and somehow that turned out to be more compelling than almost anything else on television at the time. The format never changed much over 2 decades. Abram would introduce a project, sometimes visiting a historic building or museum piece connected to the style he was about to recreate, and then he'd return to his workshop and build it, piece by piece, on camera. A blanket chest one week, a Windsor chair the next, occasionally something ambitious, like an outdoor structure or even a small boat. There were no shortcuts hidden by clever editing and no stand-in doing the difficult joinery while the camera was off. If a cut went wrong, viewers watched him fix it. That honesty became the entire appeal. People who understood woodworking recognized real skill when they saw it, and people who didn't understand it could still sense they were watching something genuine rather than staged. By the mid-1990s, the show had become something close to a ritual for a certain kind of household. Parents watched it with their kids on Saturday mornings. Retirees watched it to relearn a craft they'd set aside decades earlier. Hobbyists watched it to steal techniques for their own weekend projects. Over its run, Abram built roughly 235 separate pieces on screen, and the plans for those projects were sold directly to viewers, giving people a way to build the exact same table or cabinet in their own garage. Woodworking clubs reported growth. Local hardware and tool retailers noticed spikes in sales after new episodes aired. Instructors at woodworking schools mentioned, more than once, that new students had shown up specifically because of something they'd seen Abram build on television. None of this was engineered by a marketing team. It happened because the show simply did what it set out to do, consistently, for over 2 decades. What audiences never really saw was how much work went into making 22 minutes look effortless. Each project reportedly took somewhere between 40 and 60 hours of preparation and filming, long before a single board was cut for the camera. That included sourcing lumber, sometimes specific species and exact dimensions, planning a build sequence that would actually translate to television, and setting up the shots so the process read clearly to someone who had never picked up a chisel. And at the center of every single one of those hours was Abram himself, actually doing the work. He had one production assistant helping with things like cleanup and finishing touches, but the joinery, the measuring, the actual carpentry that people tuned in to watch, was his alone. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A lot of instructional television gets away with editing around the hard parts. This show didn't, largely because it couldn't. Abram wasn't performing a script that described woodworking. He was doing the woodworking, in real time, with real consequences if a measurement was off or a joint didn't fit the way it should. That's a very different job than hosting, and it's also a very different physical commitment than most television roles require. And it was, by any account, a demanding one. During active production seasons, working on the new Yankee Workshop functioned like a full-time job on its own, often somewhere in the range of 40 to 60 hours a week. At the same time, Abram was also continuing his work on This Old House, which had its own separate filming schedule. For years, he was effectively balancing 2 demanding production commitments at once, and the 2 roles weren't equivalent in terms of what they asked of him. On This Old House, he was one contributor among a larger team, offering expertise as the show's master carpenter. On the new Yankee Workshop, he was the entire production, the designer, the builder, the on-camera teacher, and the host, all in one person. If he didn't show up and do the work, there was no episode. The physical setting of the workshop added its own toll. It was a real working shop, not a soundstage, which meant a concrete floor, standard workbenches, and none of the ergonomic conveniences that might make standing for hours at a stretch more manageable. During filming days, Abram was reportedly on his feet for 8 to 12 hours at a time, and this wasn't a short-term arrangement. It went on for more than 20 years, season after season, project after project. Woodworking itself is repetitive physical labor. Sawing, chiseling, sanding, lifting boards, bending over a workbench, doing all of it thousands of times across 2 decades, is the kind of thing that accumulates in a person's body whether or not it ever shows on screen. By the time the show entered its later seasons, Abram was approaching 60 years old. It's worth being honest here about what can and can't be confirmed. Neither Abram nor Morash ever gave a single, detailed public breakdown of every physical ailment involved in the decision, and it would be irresponsible to invent specifics that were never stated. But multiple accounts from people close to the production, along with Abram's own public comments over the years, point toward a simple and believable explanation. 2 decades of standing on concrete and performing repetitive physical labor on camera takes a toll on a body. And by the time Abram reached his late 50s, that toll had become something worth taking seriously. What we do know for certain, because it came directly from the people involved, is how the decision itself unfolded. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't imposed on him. There were quiet conversations between Abram, Morash, and WGBH Boston, the station that produced the show, well before anything was made public. The show was not canceled due to falling ratings, and it wasn't the result of a behind-the-scenes conflict, despite the rumors that circulated for years afterward suggesting network pressure or some kind of falling out. People close to the production were consistent and clear on this point. There was no external force pushing Abram out. The show had, by every measure available at the time, no enemies. It was still fully funded through underwriting, still popular, and still profitable. It ended because Abram decided it was time for it to end, not because anyone else decided that for him. When the news became official, Abram's own statement was notably short and free of any complaint. He said simply that they'd had a great run, built challenging projects, met wonderful woodworkers, and received loyal support from millions of viewers. That was essentially it. No mention of grievances, no hints of frustration, nothing that read as anything other than gratitude and a clean sense that the run had reached its natural conclusion. Morash, who had been involved with the show from its very first day of production, put it plainly as well. The show simply couldn't continue without Abram. It wasn't a format that could be handed off to a new host, because the entire appeal was built around one specific person doing the work himself. Bringing in a replacement would have meant constant, unfavorable comparisons to the original, and Morash made clear he had no interest in putting anyone through that. There's another piece of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it says a lot about what was actually driving the decision. Abram had built his own home, a timber-frame colonial house in Carlisle, Massachusetts, largely with his own hands. Like most homeowners' projects, it had unfinished details, the kind of things that get pushed aside indefinitely when someone's professional life consumes the bulk of their time and energy. Ending the show wasn't Abram stepping away from woodworking. It was closer to the opposite. It gave him room to finally return to the woodworking that was actually his, on his own house, on his own schedule, without a camera crew or an A-date attached to it. The official announcement came on October 16, 2009, when WGBH Boston confirmed that no further episodes of the new Yankee Workshop would be produced. There was no special send-off episode built around the announcement, no ceremonial final project unveiled with fanfare. It ended the same way the show had always operated, quietly, without unnecessary drama, with everything that needed to be said already said in Abram's brief public statement. For a lot of longtime viewers, that quietness was almost more surprising than the news itself. There had been no signs the show was slowing down, no noticeable drop in quality in its final seasons, no hints of a farewell arc, nothing that suggested an ending was coming. The show had simply been doing what it always did, week after week, and then it stopped. Woodworking forums and message boards filled up almost immediately after the announcement broke. Fine Woodworking magazine, which had covered the program since its early years, later noted that the volume and emotional weight of reader responses to the news was unlike anything they'd seen around a television story before. People weren't just disappointed to lose a program from their weekly schedule. Many described it in much more personal terms, talking about how the show had shaped hobbies they still practiced, skills they'd passed down to their own kids, or confidence they'd built after attempting their very first real project because of something Abram had made look approachable on screen. That reaction revealed something the ratings numbers alone never fully captured. The show hadn't just been popular in a passive sense. It had actively shaped how a meaningful number of people spent their free time and thought about the value of building something by hand instead of simply buying it. That's a difficult thing for any television program to achieve, and it's especially rare for one that never leaned on controversy, celebrity guests, or manufactured drama to stay relevant. What also came through clearly in the fan response was an absence of anger. There was real sadness, but it read as the kind of sadness that comes from respect rather than resentment. Even without knowing every specific detail of what the decision involved, most viewers seemed to understand, in general terms, that Abram had given a great deal to the show over 2 decades, and that asking for more would have been unreasonable. The goodwill the show had built over the years carried directly into how people received its ending. In the years since, the show's legacy has held up in a way that's easy to overlook simply because it never called attention to itself. It didn't generate headlines or spark cultural debates while it was airing, and it hasn't generated many since. It simply did its job, every Saturday, for 21 seasons, and in doing so it changed how a lot of people thought about craftsmanship and the value of working with their hands. The pieces built across those seasons have aged well because they were never about chasing trends. Shaker furniture, Windsor chairs, blanket chests, reproduction pieces tied to specific historical styles. These are forms that endure precisely because they were built around function and honest joinery rather than passing fashion. Abram wasn't just showing people how to replicate a piece of furniture. He was explaining why that piece of furniture had been designed the way it was in the first place. And that kind of understanding tends to stick with people far longer than a simple set of instructions would. The show's project plans, sold as measured drawings throughout its run, gave viewers a direct path from watching an episode to actually building something themselves. A meaningful number of people did exactly that, following the same dimensions Abram had used on camera in their own garages and basements. Some of those pieces are now old enough to be passed down within families, physical objects that exist because a public television program took the time to explain, in detail, how they were made. More than a decade after the show ended, its reach extended even further. In early 2023, Morash announced that the full run of episodes had been made